is from the overflow of your heart. And it's best if it's something that you love about Jesus in January 2026, not something that you remember about Jesus who was precious to you in the year 2022, right? What do you love about Jesus? And, you might be having a conversation about, I don't know, politics or something. And maybe a politician somewhere has done something foolish or selfish or scandalous. Imagine such a thing. And maybe somebody says something like, oh gosh, well, I guess power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, or something like that. And you say, well, that's what I love about Jesus. Because apparently, in one case, power was used to bless and to serve and to heal. And I love the story about Jesus. Did you know that the night before he died, do you know the story? He would have had other things on his mind. You know what he did for his followers? In fact, one of them was about to betray him to death. And you know what he did? You know what he did? Got down on his knees and washed their feet. It's like absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, apparently with one guy, that's not true. That's what I love about Jesus. He stooped and served and suffered and bled and died. And I just think if that's what God's like, I'm in. What do you reckon? Right? A little seed you sow. And you know what happens? Probably more than half the time, nothing. Which is what happens when you sow seed, just by the way. The farmer doesn't plant the seed and then go, where's my tree? Okay? You sow the seed and you might not see any fruit to this for years, decades sometimes, right? You say something like that. That's what I love about Jesus. And you're vulnerable because you're sort of taking on the posture of Jesus, who has arms wide open to the world. And it's a very vulnerable kind of a thing. And more than half the time, nothing happens. And the tumbleweed comes blowing through Starbucks, right? And you feel like you've made a massive gaffe, all right? And you haven't said it the way that you've wanted to say it. And you sort of tripped over your words and it hasn't been a polished performance, right? Praise God for that. Polished seed doesn't work, okay? It's meant to be rough and ready and scattered, okay? And most of the time, there's no visible impact right there and then. Most of the time. I say that as an evangelist with a capital E. It's on my business card. Even as an evangelist, most of the time, I offer Christ, they are not picking up what I'm laying down. Most of the time, right? That's normal. That's really normal. But we're not primarily into gaining converts. We're primarily into offering Christ. And so once I've offered Christ, job done. I've sowed the seed, right? And it's important to know this about people. People almost never change their mind in the middle of a conversation. Have you noticed that? You might sow a seed about that's what I love about Jesus. And Rich has got a great story about a guy he baptized on Sunday. And the first few times he was offering Christ to this guy, it was not warmly received, to put it mildly. But the seed works low and it works slow and you go long. People almost never change their mind in the middle of a conversation. What usually happens is you say something brilliant, right? Or you recommend some incredible book or something, right? And your friend just sneers at you and the conversation you think goes terribly. And then like 18 months later, they are totally changing their tune. They're saying exactly what you said to them. And you say, I told you that 18 months ago. And they say, oh, I don't think so. I think I came up with it by myself. And then they'll say, probably not me. It was probably, there's this book that I read about. I told you to read that book. They've forgotten about it entirely, right? They don't change their mind in the conversation, okay? I think that should help us set expectations for what normal evangelism looks like. Don't expect that they're going, oh, I see everything differently now. You were right and I was wrong. If that's ever happened in your experience, let me know the story. That sounds wild. But seed number one, that's what I love about Jesus, ... Seed number two, I couldn't have gotten through, I don't know what X is for you. I couldn't have gotten through that without Jesus. And at that point, you're telling a story of how Jesus met you in a dark time. And I couldn't have gotten through lockdown without Jesus. I couldn't have gotten through those operations without Jesus. I couldn't have gotten through that family breakdown without Jesus. I couldn't have gotten through whatever it is And as you're narrating that story, you're not narrating a hero's journey in which you made it out of the darkness and into the light. You're narrating the gospel in which Christ met you when you were vulnerable. And this too requires vulnerability, doesn't it? To open up to things you cannot cope with, but only Jesus. To talk about how life has hacked you down to the ground, but then the holy seed is there in the stump. You're telling a very gospel-shaped story when you're telling that kind of story. I couldn't have gotten through X without Jesus. And then I love that because that enfranchises, if that's your testimony to your friend, that enfranchises the person who grew up in a Christian home and can't remember a time when they didn't love Jesus, which that's certainly the testimony I want for my children. I don't want a very interesting testimony for my children. I just want them to say, I've always grown up in church family and they love Jesus and my parents seem to love Jesus and I haven't seen life any other way. But they still have a great testimony because they can still say, but I couldn't have gotten through that without Jesus. And if they say I couldn't have gotten through depression without Jesus, right, their friend is all ears because they just want help with X. If you feel like the only thing that will connect with the non-Christian is a story of darkness to light in which I make it out of the darkness and into the light, if that's the only thing that you think will connect with a non-Christian, you'll be very tempted to lie about your testimony. And Christians do this all the time, right? You know, they invent dark nights of the soul that were really kind of, dusky for an afternoon. Or wilderness wanderings that was really more like a city break to Babylon and then back again, right? And because Christians feel like we need to crank up the darkness in order to make a good story. You don't have to crank up that kind of darkness. Life is hard enough. How do you talk about Jesus getting you through the stuff in life that is just too much for you? And then your friend doesn't care that you grew up in the church at that point. That doesn't either count for or against your testimony at that stage. But if you found help for X and your friend wants help with X, then you've got a connection. That's what I love about my church. I'm always bigging up my church all the time. I'm using that line the whole time. That's what I love about All Souls. And then I'll tell them stories. It depends who I'm talking to, what aspect of church life that I big up. Sometimes it's just like, oh man, I don't know how to do like parenting, but there are 70 other kids who are under 11 in our church, and therefore there are like dozens and dozens of parents who are equally clueless, and it's just brilliant to constantly be in the lives of people who are equally clueless, isn't that? And you just sort of, or sometimes I say I need to stop every week and get off the mill that I've been running on. And, there's something that we do at All Souls every week, and it always sounds bizarre to say it to begin with, but then it makes all the sense in the world. We actually out loud together confess what morons we have been that week. Like, we literally talk about how spiritually stupid we've been that week. And we say it out loud in front of one another. And I just find that gives my heart just the best reset. Because we all think hypocrisy is a terrible problem, don't we? Well, here I think is the most hypocrisy-resistant institution in the world. Like there's hypocrites everywhere, and there's hypocrites in church, that's true. But what's the most hypocrisy-resistant institution? We actually get in front of one another and say, I've been an idiot this week, I really have. And I need the forgiveness of God. We say it all together. Can you imagine if, the government did that? Can you imagine cabinet meetings on a Monday morning? Let's go around the room. How have you been an idiot this week? And that's what I love about my church. And sometimes I talk about some vertical elements about church in terms of stop, recenter, give thanks to God, say sorry. Sometimes I talk about vertical aspects. Sometimes I talk about horizontal aspects. The community is just amazing. Big up your church. Big up your church. That leads to really good places. But as you keep on doing that, it's just really interesting where... It's probably gone to sleep, has it? Where Matthew 13 finishes. So it's all, I was about to say it's all very seedy in Matthew 13. That's not what I mean. It's all very agricultural in Matthew 13. And you sow seed, and then there's another parable about the enemy comes in and sows weeds. What are you meant to do? And Jesus never gives you plan B. Like he never gives you plan B. It's like, there's a path. I know what we'll do. We'll get shovels and break up the soil. Jesus is like, no, forget about that. Sow the seed. You're like, there's rocks everywhere. I know what we'll do. We'll dig out the rocks. Jesus is like, no. Just sow the seed. There's thorns everywhere. We'll get some secateurs. We'll cut back the thorns. And Jesus is like, no, just sow the seed. Among the thorns. Yeah. You've got one church job. One job, church. You've got one job, right? You've got one job. Sow on the path, sow among the rocks, sow among the thorns. And then there's an enemy that sows weeds. Like invest in weed killer? Would you'd think? He's like, no, keep on sowing. Keep on sowing. You've got one job. Plan A is preach the word. There is no plan B. And then, having done a heck of a lot of that, Jesus finishes all these parables with Matthew 13. He then told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Cool question. When did we last see those birds in Matthew 13? Those pesky birds? What were they doing last time we saw them? Eating the seed, right? They seemed so much bigger than the seed, didn't they? They seemed so much bigger than the work of the kingdom. These birds that Jesus says, it's like the evil one. It's like there are dark supernatural forces at play as we sow the seed. And initially, it seems like they get the victory. Initially. To begin with, they're gobbling up the seed. Fast forward to the end. And there is this kingdom reality in which now these birds are perched in the tree that was grown by the seed of the word. Now they are dependent upon and enfolded within the kingdom that Jesus' word has grown. Isn't that interesting? To begin with, they look so big, and in Jesus' day, here comes the word of God. And the Romans go, nope, bury him. But what happens when you bury the seed? Up he pops. He rises again and he propagates, right? And the disciples, they are given life through the word that is implanted into them. James chapter 1, right? The word of life is implanted into them. And they produce fruit according to their kinds, right? And so, but what happens to them? Well, they get cut down. But then, this is the way of the seed, isn't it? The seed gives rise to a tree. The tree gives rise to many fruit. The fruit gives rise to many seeds. In the next generation, you've got hundreds of seeds. And then in the next generation, you've got thousands of seeds. And then you've got tens of thousands of seeds. And it goes exponential, right? To the point where Jesus says there is a kingdom that has been grown by something that looks so weak and pathetic. And it grows to the point where even those who are most against the kingdom cannot help but depend on that kingdom. And what's happening in the West in the year 2026 is that there are a lot of people who are pecking away at the kingdom of Christ, opposed to the ways of Jesus, but also dependent upon the ways of Jesus in 1,000 different ways. And your friends and my friends, they have a similar shopping list of complaints against the church. And they go, peck, 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 peck. And my friends and your friends, and I am certain it's the same among Westerners in Birmingham. but it will be true even of westernized immigrants to Birmingham. And it will even be true of westernized Muslims. But my friends think that Christianity is unequal, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, and regressive. That's the shopping list of complaints that my friends have. But as they go peck, 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 what are they perched upon? They are perched upon some convictions about how life ought to be. And if they think that the church is obscenely unequal, bigoted, that's because they're perched on a conviction that we ought to be equal. And if they are convinced that the church is sometimes cruel, it's because they believe in compassion. And if they hate the church when it is coercive, it's because they believe in consent. And when they rail against the church being unenlightened, it's because they believe in enlightenment. And if they rail against the church being anti-science, it's because they believe in science with a capital S. And if they think we're restrictive, it's because they believe in freedom. And if they think we're regressive, it's because they believe in progress, right? And so the air we all breathe is a Christian-ish kind of an air, right? Even in the post-Christian West, where everybody just thinks that Christians are unequal, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, and regressive. That's because, actually, we all believe in equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And it is the Jesus revolution that has kind of taught us that these values are paramount. And where we're at as a society is a society that's kind of convinced of this stuff, trying to ditch the Jesus bit and keep going. And it kind of doesn't work. And as we sort of conclude our time together, I just want to think about the soil that we're sowing into and the ways in which it is a Christian-ish kind of a soil and the ways in which it is an anti-Christian and post-Christian kind of a soil. And G.K. Chesterton, writing 100 years ago, absolutely nailed it. He said, the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. So I mentioned earlier, diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Unthinkable without the Jesus revolution. Unthinkable without 1 Corinthians 12. Genuinely. The reason why we prize diversity, equity, and inclusion is absolutely because of Jesus, without doubt. But you divorce that from the Jesus story, and you divorce it from the other virtues that Jesus has taught us, and the virtues are running amok and marauding, right? And this is kind of the world that we are all a part of. And so there is the sort of the Christian fruit that the gospel of Jesus has taught us, whether people go to church or not. It has taught us all these kinds of virtues. But there's a kind of a post-Christian appropriation. And whereas in the Bible we are all one in Christ Jesus, I think a post-Christian appropriation of that is we believe in human rights and in the individual rights that we have, but we've divorced those rights from responsibilities. And the rights that we wield are less about my human right as a shield against the tyranny of the majority, which is kind of where human rights discourse came from. Human rights discourse was always about the king doesn't have a right to take away the worshipping rights of the Jewish minority in your land. They are to have a right to worship in their own kinds of way, and that's a shield that can protect them from tyranny. So rights really came to us as a very Christian idea about how the little guy cannot have his or her rights traded away and lost in the shuffle because of the tyrannical majority. And so rights were always a kind of a shield. Nowadays, rights are a sword. I've got my right? And it's a sword that's wielded against other rights claims. And now rights necessarily will clash with one another, but we tend to go on the offensive with our rights, in claiming our rights in quite obligated, entitled ways. Compassion. Jesus taught us the goodness of compassion, the goodness of, we worship the one who is the sacrificial victim on the cross, and the one who rose again to say, go and do likewise. Go and be a good Samaritan to others. Just as I've been a good Samaritan to you, go and be a good Samaritan to others, and to value and prize the marginalized, the poor, and the weak in order to lift them up. But there can then become a kind of a race to the bottom. There can then become a race to claim victim status. The oppression Olympics, competitive victimhood, all that kind of stuff. This is something that can happen, and that we can point to examples. It does happen. In the realm of sex, Christianity brought consent right into the heart of the bedroom as a key virtue. Now it's the only virtue, right? And whatever two consenting adults do in the privacy of their own dungeon is up to them, right? Okay, and it's consent only, right? And that's the only kind of it's a sexual ethic that we really, really insist upon, and I'm very glad that we really, really insist upon, but it doesn't now sit in the context of other things like covenant and commitment and all those sorts of things. In terms of Enlightenment, Christianity invented the university. There can become a kind of an elitism among those who are the graduate classes. And the graduate classes tend to set the agenda for the rest of the world, and the elites can consider everybody else unenlightened. And everybody else doesn't like that very much. Science, well, we'll see how science is questionable on both sides of this diagram. But it becomes difficult to believe somebody that they follow the science when they also believe that you can be born in the wrong body and those sorts of things, right? And we've seen how actually malleable the science can be in the interests of ideology, right? And post-Christian ideology can actually sit quite loose to the science at times in order to progress certain agendas. Freedom, in a Christian sense, has become individual liberty for me. It's become a freedom from obligation, freedom from responsibility, freedom from community, freedom from... And as soon as you start saying freedom from, free from, you start to get very lonely, right? And every Google image search you ever do for freedom, it's always like some guy all by himself on a mountain at sunset. And I always think, he looks lonely. Apart from the photographer, there's no one in his life at all. And we cling to an individual liberty that cuts us loose from obligation and community. And it is absolutely Christianity that gives us hope in progress. The yeast works its way through the batch of dough. The seed gives rise to the tree. Cross gives rise to resurrection. From the garden, we end up in a city. It's the Bible that's given us a belief in progress, but there's a kind of a post-Christian utopianism that is never content with now. And imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. You're like John Lennon. Yeah, imagine people just living for today. What a flight of fancy that would be. But there can be a kind of a utopianism, a post-Christian utopianism. And this ideology, with Christianity, with institutional Christianity more and more in the rearview mirror, this has sort of been the post-war settlement. Alec Ryrie, a historian, has just written a book called The Age of Hitler. He thinks that post-World War II, the West has largely been living with the World War II myth. And the World War II myth supplanted the Christian myth. And Hitler is now a more important moral figure than Jesus Christ. For 1900 years, the moral vision of the West was, look at what Jesus did, do what Jesus did. For the last 100 years, the moral vision of the West has been, look at what Hitler did, don't do what Hitler did, right? So we've had a pro-Jesus first 1900 years, and we've had an anti-Hitler last 100 years. But there's a significant difference between a positive vision in Christ and merely rejecting a negative vision in Hitler. And coming out of World War II, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we've had a kind of a post-war consensus that has sounded similar enough to Christianity to kind of bridge the gap between institutional Christianity fading and this new post-Christian kind of worldview rising up. But it's not the same thing. It's really not the same thing. And there are a whole bunch of birds who are perched in trees here in Birmingham, and they're saying equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment means, well, but the church is unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, regressive, like peck, 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 peck. But this has overplayed its hand. The post-war consensus, we are now, Alec Ryrie's point is, we are now moving beyond the anti-Hitler age. And part of that is just to do with timing. It's now out of our living memory. You know, World War II veterans are now 100 plus, right? If they are still alive. And simply being able to say, you don't want to be a Nazi, do you? That is having less and less purchase as the memory of the Nazis is fading more and more. And now people are less and less afraid of sounding like a Nazi, right? And people are more and more mistrustful of this because this has become the hegemonic, the authoritative, the vision for life here. And this is what is right. And the human personality never likes that. The human personality always kicks against that. Okay, and Karen from HR is telling me that I'm a bad person. And there's a whole bunch of people who are sick and tired of Karen from HR being so darned moralistic. And now, these guys are kind of like the elder brother in the story of the prodigal son, right? It used to be, when Tim Keller wrote The Prodigal God, 2008, 9, something like that, I don't know. When Tim Keller wrote The Prodigal God 15 years ago, it was very, very easy to say, okay, the elder brother with the wagging finger saying, younger brother, you shouldn't, be so disobedient and rebellious. It's very easy to think, oh, I know what the elder brother type's like. Those are the conservatives, right? Elder brother, they're the conservatives. And I know what the younger brothers are like. They're like the progressives who go after liberty and, squander the wealth in the far country. And I know how that maps onto things now. That is not really the landscape of the West anymore, I don't think. I think because this has been in the ascendant for so long, I think a lot of people now see this is elder brothery. Karen from HR is the elder brother. And Joe Rogan, right? Joe Rogan, podcaster, mixed martial arts dude. He's a dude. He's the archetypal dude, right? He voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016. He voted for Donald Trump in 2024 because he's sick of Karen telling him what to do, right? And so he's much more a younger brother type, isn't he? He's Joe Rogan. He's free, but he's a conservative. He's now a barstool conservative, right? And the barstool conservatives are now the younger brothers, right? And the post-Christian kind of morality is now more the finger-wagging kind of elder brother kind of type stuff. And there has been a backlash, okay? And these guys, Trump would call all these guys the woke, right? Probably, that term has a lot of history behind it. But certainly these guys call that stuff wokery, right? And now there's an anti-woke backlash. And instead of the Christian fruit of equality, we're reacting against rights as swords. And we're starting to question, are there even such things as human rights? Maybe we just need to default to the individual, right? Maybe that's the thing that the West has brought to the world, the individual, right? And so in the anti-woke backlash, we have individuals who are, maybe they have been raised to believe that this is the superordinate virtue over everything else. Be kind. Hashtag be kind. But they're so sick of the victim card being played that they're just like, let's shut up about compassion now. And they're so sick of virtue signaling that they think, let's just shut up about the virtue then, right? And empathy can be used so cynically. So let's stop talking about compassion and empathy. Let's just talk about competence now. We're just individuals who are competently making our way through the world, right? This is sort of part of the anti-woke backlash. This will be part of, if you're seeing young men show up in your churches, I'm trying not to kind of cast this as awful, because I think some of these points land if they are reactions to some of this. But certainly the younger guys who are coming into your churches, they believe in the individual and competence. And when it comes to male and female, they think that this side has really overplayed its hand when it comes to male and female. And when you start saying that you can be born in the wrong body and then giving puberty blockers to children who cannot consent to puberty blockers, and when you're so messed up about gender, and when the new thing is just not working, they're just like, well, let's just go back to men are men and women are women, and we know what that is. And it then becomes quite a power-driven thing. Take this to extremes, and you're in the realm of Andrew Tate and that kind of thing, but there are also some people saying much more sensible things in the manosphere. It's good to be a man. You guys have been talking about toxic masculinity the whole time. I'll give you toxic masculinity. That's what Andrew Tate is saying. And some people in the manosphere are saying, I'll give you authentic masculinity. And maybe that could be an antidote to toxic masculinity. But there's a reaffirmation of the manosphere, right? Of the Joe Rogan types, and Andrew Huberman and Chris Williamson and people like that. When it comes to enlightenment, these guys are just sick of the elites, thinking they're better because they've got a degree, and there's a kind of an anti-elite kind of streak to this anti-woke backlash. You can kind of understand it, can't you? Again, it's sort of science in inverted commas, because there might be all sorts of beliefs about vaccines and things over here that don't always line up with the science. We always use the science cynically, don't we, as self-justifying human creatures. When it comes to freedom, it is about autonomy, and let's get it done. Let's shoulder burdens and march forthrightly up the hill under our own steam. And because of the utopianism of this side, there can be a yearning for something traditional, but sometimes it's not. They don't actually want something that's traditional. They want the trad chic, right? And so people will hearken back to AI-generated images of the 1950s, right? Not that they actually want to embed themselves in a tradition and in a community, because that would cut against the autonomy thing. Like they just want AI to give them a hallucinated fantasy of what it would be like to live in 1952. But there is the desire for trad stuff. And, a guy comes to our church and his first evangelistic question is, so where do you stand on the filioque clause? I'm sorry, you're asking me about the Nicene Creed and a 1,000-year-old debate about whether the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. I instantly just thought this person was a Christian. I was like, oh, what church do you usually go to? I was like, I don't go to church, but I need to know, right? And instantly I was like, I think I know what YouTube channels you watch. I think I do. Harking back to something traditional and embodied and ancient and durable is something that's kind of happening. And so this is the mission field in so many ways among those who are more westernized, right? This is kind of the mission field. And in a sense, what I kind of think Tom Holland is a kind of a prophet. Tom Holland, the historian, not Spider-Man. Tom Holland, the historian, is kind of a prophet taking people from the left, and sort of not coincidentally, this is on the left and this is on the right, okay? So on the left, Tom Holland in his book Dominion is kind of saying to the world, there is this stuff which is sort of like the Christian virtues run amok. And it's come from this stuff, right? On this side, you might think of somebody like a Jordan Peterson as somebody who's speaking to young men, saying that the West has given us the individual. You can do it. You can march forthrightly up the hill because you are competent. And you don't need to go to university. In fact, Jordan Peterson was essentially kicked out of University of Toronto. And you can listen to his very lengthy lectures, and you can do the Peterson Academy and all that kind of stuff, but there's a kind of an anti-intellectual, an anti-elitist, not anti-intellectual, anti-elitist sort of streak to this. And, he'll tell people to go back to churches as a way of kind of honouring tradition and that sort of thing. And I think, there will be people who come to your churches from the right, and Peterson might have had something to do with it. There are people from the left, and I think Tom Holland has a lot of interesting things to say to such people. To both of them, you do a Vicky Pollard. You say, yeah, but no. But yeah, okay? Yes, but no, but yes. You're like, oh man, human rights, what a beautiful idea that every single member of the human family is the moral equal of every other member of the human family. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, gay or straight, male or female, right? And your rights cannot be traded off against the greater good, because you have this kind of divine spark almost. You have this human dignity that is not achieved. It is simply given to you. Yes. But no, you don't get that from a secular view of the world. Like, we are all clever apes with inviolable human rights. Doesn't work, does it? Really doesn't work. We are all clever apes with inviolable human rights. You don't get it on this atheist vision of the world that you think that you have. It's like, yes, but no. But in Christ, have you ever wondered why we have a vision of the human that is exalted above all other humans? That we have this vision of the human that you can participate in by grace, a vision of the human that can judge certain behaviors as inhumane. It judges, but it also includes. This has come from a vision of Jesus, right? We believe in God the human, and I think God the human is really, at the end of the day, the only foundation for humanism. I'm a Christian humanist, and I spend a lot of my time telling humanists to be Christians and telling Christians to be humanists, right? Just like Martin Luther King owned the label of Christian humanist, just as G.K. Chesterton owned the label of Christian humanist, and T.S. Eliot owned the label of Christian humanist. John Calvin owned the label Christian humanist, right? There's a yes, but no, but yes that you say to such people. And over here, they've jumped onto the Jordan Peterson train and they've showed up in your church on a Sunday. Well, you're kind of like, well, yes. Like, Christianity did invent the individual, like genuinely. The idea that you are a center of moral agency and worth and dignity that needs to be protected from others. It's got a long intellectual history to it, and yeah, you are a soul before the living God, accountable to Him, and you are an individual. But no. Standing by yourself as an individual, that is to be lost. That is to be incredibly lonely and atomized. And then to trust to your own autonomy and competence to march forthrightly up the hill. Oh my goodness. With these guys, I often do a thing with Luke 15. And I let me finish with this. I say to them, look, Western culture has been like the younger son that has taken the inheritance, wandered off into the far country, and squandered it in wild living, and we are kind of in a pit. And in Jordan Peterson's terms, we've gone from order into chaos, right? And some people are starting to recognize the chaos, and And what Jordan Peterson teaches them to do is go to church where you can find order. And that's a little bit like in Luke 15. Notice how the younger brother in the pit, in the pigsty, he says, I will go back to my father, and I will say, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. So what does he want to be? He actually wants to be a slave, doesn't he? He's had enough chaos. Now he wants to try the order thing. And then I say to people, well, look what happened when the younger brother is embraced by the father. He says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And before he has the chance to say, make me like one of your hired men, the father says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. The father does not receive him back as a slave, only as a son. Jordan Peterson, you are not met at the top of the hill. You are met down in the pit, not as a would-be slave, but as a son who is still stinking of pig. Nevertheless, you are robed. Nevertheless, you are brought into the family. And then you say to such people, I wonder what would happen the next day after the party in Luke chapter 15. I reckon that son would want to work in the family field. Harder than the elder brother ever did, but not as a slave, but as a beloved son, right? And that's what Jesus is offering you. He's not offering you more order. He's offering you something completely different. He's offering you Christ and the grace of Christ. So for people coming in that direction, those are the sorts of things I start to say to them.